May 16th, 1929, 8:30 in the evening, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The marquee lights of the Stanley Theatre cast long shadows across Market Street as two men stepped out into the cool evening air. The shorter one, stocky, wearing a tailored grey suit that cost more than most Americans made in a year, paused to light a cigar. His face was round, almost boyish, except for the scar that ran down his left cheek. The man beside him was bigger, broader, his eyes scanning the street the way a bodyguard's eyes always scan streets. Al Capone took a long drag on his cigar. Frank Rio stood close, one hand inside his jacket, fingers resting on the grip of a .38 caliber revolver. They never saw the detectives coming. Two plainclothes officers materialized from the shadows like they'd been waiting there all night. Because they had been. Detective Malone stepped forward first, badge already in his hand, his partner Creedon flanking the two men. "Mr. Capone, we need to see what's in your pockets." What happened next should have been chaos. This was Al Capone, the most feared man in America, the king of Chicago, the gangster who commanded 500 soldiers and had ordered the deaths of dozens of rivals. His bodyguard was armed. The street was dark. They could have run. They could have fought. But Capone didn't move. He didn't resist. He didn't even look surprised. He took another drag on his cigar, exhaled slowly, and offered his wrists without a word. No fight, no protest, just quiet surrender from the most dangerous man in America. Within 16 hours, the most powerful gangster in American history would be sentenced to a year in prison. The fastest trial Philadelphia had ever seen. Too fast, impossibly fast, almost as if it had been arranged. What nobody knew, what history would debate for generations, is that Al Capone hadn't been caught. He'd been delivered. Not by the law, not by his enemies, but by the men who'd spent the last 4 days eating dinner at his table, drinking his champagne, calling him friend, his mentor, his allies, the people who'd built his empire alongside him. The Atlantic City Conference wasn't a peace summit. It was a trial, and Al Capone, the guest of honor, had already been found guilty before he ever walked through the door. To understand how the most powerful gangster in America ended up in handcuffs by design, you need to go back 3 months, to a frozen February morning in Chicago, to the sound of machine gun fire echoing off a garage wall, to the moment Al Capone made himself untouchable and, in doing so, signed his own death warrant. In February of 1929, Al Capone was 30 years old and worth more than most corporations. His criminal empire generated $100 million annually. He controlled gambling halls, brothels, speakeasies, and bootlegging operations across Chicago and into the suburbs. Over 500 men answered to him. Mayors took his calls. Police captains cashed his checks. Judges ruled in his favor. He was untouchable, and he wanted everyone to know it. Capone gave interviews to newspapers. He attended boxing matches in the front row. He opened soup kitchens for the poor and made sure photographers captured every ladleful. He was building a reputation, making himself a celebrity, turning his name into something larger than crime. Then came Valentine's Day, February 14th, 1929, 10:30 a.m., a garage at 2122 North Clark Street. 7 men connected to Bugs Moran's North Side gang stood inside, waiting for a shipment of hijacked whiskey. They never saw it coming. 4 assassins entered through the front door. 2 wore police uniforms. The others carried Thompson submachine guns beneath their coats. They lined the 7 men against the brick wall, aimed, and fired, 70 rounds in seconds. When the gunfire stopped, 7 men lay dead. 1 man, Frank Gusenberg, survived long enough to be asked who shot him. Even dying, his only answer was silence. Moran himself escaped only because he arrived late. Photographs of the carnage appeared in newspapers from coast to coast. The public, already weary of gangland violence, erupted in outrage. Within weeks of taking office in March, President Herbert Hoover personally ordered federal agencies to concentrate all resources on one target, Al Capone. But here's what the newspapers didn't understand. Here's what the federal agents couldn't see. The massacre didn't just make Capone a target for the law, it made him a liability to his own kind. Every bootlegger, every gambling boss, every crime lord in America suddenly had federal heat because of one man's arrogance. Johnny Torrio, Capone's mentor, had seen enough. The men who preferred shadows to spotlights, who built empires in silence, now watched their entire operation threatened by one man's appetite for fame. 3 months later, an invitation arrived in Chicago, a conference, Atlantic City, the nation's top crime figures. Capone was the guest of honor. He was also the sacrifice. May 13th, 1929, Atlantic City, New Jersey. They called it America's Playground, a strip of sand and sin stretching along the Jersey shore where prohibition was a suggestion rather than a law. The boardwalk hummed with tourists. The salt air carried the sounds of jazz from a dozen clubs, and the hotels rose like monuments to American excess. This was a town where anything could be bought, anyone could be bribed, and the man who made it all possible was waiting at the train station. Enoch "Nucky" Johnson ran Atlantic City the way a king runs a kingdom: politician, fixer, crime boss. He controlled the police, the judges, the hotels, and the flow of illegal liquor into every speakeasy on the eastern seaboard. When the nation's most powerful gangsters needed a place to meet without interference, Nucky guaranteed safe passage. The guest list read like a who's who of American organized crime. Johnny Torrio arrived first, the elder statesman, the man who had built Chicago's underworld before handing it to his protege. Lucky Luciano came from New York, young and hungry, already whispering about a national syndicate that would make them all rich. Meyer Lansky checked in with his new bride Anna, ostensibly on his honeymoon, but nobody believed that for a second. Frank Costello, the diplomat, Bugsy Siegel, the enforcer, representatives from Detroit, Cleveland, Kansas City, Boston. Every major crime figure east of the Mississippi gathered in one place. And then there was Capone. The trouble started at the Breakers Hotel. The desk clerk took one look at the names on the registration cards, noticed they weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and refused them rooms. Capone's face went crimson. He began screaming at Nucky Johnson in the middle of the lobby, cursing, spitting, veins bulging in his neck. He cocked his fist back, ready to swing at his host. Nucky, several inches taller and considerably broader, grabbed Capone by the shoulders and shoved him into a waiting limousine. "Everyone follow me," he ordered. They relocated to the Ritz-Carlton. But Capone wasn't finished. Inside the new hotel, still raging, he ripped paintings off the walls and hurled them at Nucky. Frames shattered. Glass scattered across the marble floor. The other bosses watched in silence. Capone thought he was the king, the guest of honor, the man they all needed. But as he threw those paintings, as his face twisted with fury over a hotel room, every boss in that lobby was thinking the same thing. This is the man who will destroy us all. For the first 3 days, there were parties, liquor flowed, women appeared, fur capes for the wives. Business discussions happened with pants rolled up, bare feet in the Atlantic Ocean, and somewhere, in a private suite, the real meeting was taking place. The one Al Capone wasn't invited to. The official agenda was noble enough. Stop the killing. Divide territories so every boss knew his boundaries. Prepare for the day. Prohibition ended and the liquor money dried up. Build something lasting, something organized, something that would make them all richer than they already were. A national crime syndicate. Business, not bloodshed. The meetings happened in hotel suites and on the beach. Serious men in expensive suits rolled up their trousers, removed their shoes, and walked barefoot through the Atlantic surf while discussing murder and money. It was absurd and brilliant. No wiretaps in the ocean. No witnesses, but the gulls. But Capone couldn't resist the spotlight. He strolled down the boardwalk with an entourage of bodyguards, puffing his cigar, tipping his hat to strangers. Photographers from the Atlantic City Daily Press captured him lounging in a rolling chair like visiting royalty. The newspaper called him a machine gun maestro, beer baron, and nationally known racketeer. Capone clipped the article and kept it. He was proud. The other bosses were furious. Every photograph was evidence. Every headline was an invitation for federal agents to start asking questions. Lucky Luciano slipped in and out of the hotel without a single reporter noticing his face. Meyer Lansky conducted business in whispers. Frank Costello never let anyone take his picture. But Capone treated the conference like a coronation. He even found time to meet Moses Annenberg, the man who controlled the distribution of William Randolph Hearst's newspapers in Chicago. They discussed a national wire service for horse racing, a legitimate seeming operation that could process bets and launder money from coast to coast. Capone saw it as his next empire, a new kingdom after Prohibition ended. On the third day, the topic turned to Chicago's violence, the massacre, the headlines, the federal heat. Capone leaned back in his chair and shrugged. I don't see the problem. Silence. The other bosses exchanged glances. Johnny Torrio, who had built the Chicago operation before handing it to Capone, who had taught him everything, spoke carefully. The problem, Al, is that you're making problems for everyone else. Capone laughed it off. Luciano said nothing. He just watched. What Capone didn't see, what he couldn't have imagined, may have been happening 2 floors above him. According to one theory that would circulate for decades, Johnny Torrio met privately with Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello. The topic wasn't territories. It wasn't wire services. The topic was Al Capone. The massacre brought heat on all of us. Torrio allegedly argued, every federal agent in the country is looking at Chicago. As long as Al is walking around free, they're looking at us too. He needs to disappear. The younger bosses supposedly agreed. For a while. Long enough for things to calm down. Whether this meeting actually occurred remains disputed by historians. But what happened next suggested that someone, somewhere, had made a decision. And Al Capone, for all his power, would never see it coming. If the theory was true, the plan required precision. Capone needed to go to prison, but not for murder, not for bootlegging, not for anything that would put him away for decades. A minor charge, something survivable, something that would remove him from the spotlight just long enough for the heat to fade. Carrying a concealed weapon in Pennsylvania carried a maximum sentence of 1 year. Some accounts claim the Philadelphia police were arranged, that detectives received $10,000 each to be waiting at the right place at the right time. Other historians argue Capone was simply an out-of-town gangster who got caught by a tough judge. The truth may never be known. On May 16th, the final morning of the conference, something changed. Whether Torrio pulled Capone aside for a private conversation, whether the other bosses delivered an ultimatum, or whether Capone simply made a calculation of his own remains debated to this day. What is certain is this. Capone left Atlantic City knowing the federal government wanted him destroyed. He knew the massacre had made him a target, and he knew that a short prison sentence on a minor charge might be safer than walking the streets of Chicago with a bounty on his head. Some say his allies convinced him. Others say he engineered the whole thing himself. A few historians argue it was simply bad luck. A gangster caught in the wrong city with the wrong weapon. But the result was the same. That afternoon, Capone and his bodyguard Frank Rio climbed into a car headed for Philadelphia. They planned to catch a train back to Chicago, but somewhere near Camden, the car broke down. Mechanical failure, bad luck, or perhaps something else entirely. They arrived in Philadelphia hours late. The train to Chicago had already departed. The next one wouldn't leave until morning. Capone decided to kill time at a movie theater, the Stanley, on Market Street. A gangster picture was playing. 2 Philadelphia detectives were already waiting outside. They knew Capone was coming. They knew he was carrying a .38 caliber revolver. Some accounts say each detective received $10,000 to be there at exactly the right moment. Everything was arranged. The breakdown, the missed train, the theatre, the arrest. May 16th, 1929, 6:30 p.m. Capone arrives in Philadelphia. 8:30 p.m. He walks out of the Stanley Theatre. By 10:15 the next morning, he stands before a grand jury. By 12:21 p.m., he is sentenced to 1 year in prison. The most powerful gangster in America will be in a cell before sunset, and the men who put him there will already be dividing up his business. May 16th, 1929, 8:30 in the evening. The Stanley Theatre's doors swung open, and Al Capone stepped into the Philadelphia night. The movie had been forgettable. The cigar in his pocket was Cuban. His bodyguard, Frank Rio, walked one step behind, hand resting near his waistband where a revolver waited. The detectives materialized from the shadows like they had been standing there for hours. Because they had. The search took seconds. The .38 caliber revolver was exactly where they expected it to be. Capone offered no resistance. He simply looked at the detective, took a long drag on his cigar, and said nothing. What followed was justice at impossible speed. Arrested at 8:30 p.m., brought before a grand jury at 10:15 the next morning. Trial at noon. Sentenced at 12:21 p.m. Less than 16 hours from handcuffs to prison bars. Philadelphia had never moved so fast. No trial in the city's history had concluded so quickly. Because this wasn't justice, this was choreography. Director of Public Safety Lemuel Schofield interviewed Capone that night. The gangster spoke freely, almost boastfully, with the idea in mind of making peace among the gangsters in Chicago. I spent the week in Atlantic City, and I have the word of each of the men participating that there shall be no more shootings. Capone told the truth. He just didn't understand it yet. There would be no more shootings. Not because the gangsters had made peace, but because they had removed the one man who couldn't stop shooting. In August, Capone was transferred to Eastern State Penitentiary. His cell looked nothing like a prison. A polished desk held a brass lamp. Paintings hung on the walls. A cabinet radio played waltzes through the evening. Guards called the cell block Park Avenue, even behind bars. Capone tried to be king, but every gangster from Boston to Baltimore understood what had happened. Al Capone, the most powerful man in organized crime, had been arrested 16 hours after leaving a conference with his closest allies. The message was clear. If they could do this to Capone, they could do it to anyone. Make headlines, bring heat, become a problem, and you would be solved. On his first night in that luxury cell, Capone finally understood. The conference wasn't a negotiation, it was a trial, and Johnny Torrio, his mentor, his father, had delivered the verdict. Capone served nearly 10 months. He walked out of prison in March of 1930, believing he would reclaim his throne. Within weeks, the Chicago Crime Commission named him Public Enemy Number 1. The federal investigation that had begun with the massacre continued building. In 1931, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years. They sent him first to Atlanta, then to Alcatraz, where the fog and the cold and the isolation slowly broke him. The men who sacrificed him inherited everything. Johnny Torrio became an advisor to Lucky Luciano and helped architect the national crime syndicate he had always envisioned. Luciano rose to command the 5 families, becoming the most powerful mob boss America had ever seen. Meyer Lansky built a gambling empire that stretched from Havana to Las Vegas, dying old and rich while federal agents spent decades trying to catch him. Frank Costello earned the title Prime Minister of the Underworld, a diplomat who wielded power through whispers rather than bullets. They learned from Capone's mistakes. They avoided headlines. They stayed in shadows. And they made fortunes that dwarfed anything Capone had ever accumulated. Al Capone thought he was invincible. He believed his power made him untouchable, but he forgot the first rule of power. You are never more powerful than the people who put you there. When those people decide you are a liability, all that power disappears. In 16 hours, Capone proved something that May night in Philadelphia that most people miss. The most dangerous enemy is never the one pointing a gun at your chest. It is the one sitting across the dinner table, asking about your health, suggesting you take a vacation, the mentor who built you, the friend who knows your weaknesses. When they decide you are a problem, there is no defense. Capone walked into Atlantic City as king. He walked out as a sacrifice. His empire didn't collapse. It thrived, because the men who removed him were smarter, quieter, and infinitely more patient. Somewhere in Eastern State Penitentiary, Capone listened to a waltz on his expensive radio, still believing he was in control. The truth was simpler. The most powerful gangster in America had been voted out. He was the only one who never got a vote.